I'd be very happy to go document for document, fact by fact, with any Israel hater who is scoffing at this, because these were the hard decisions that were actually made.
The author of Reclaiming Israel's History, Roots, Rights, and the Struggle for Peace, David Brog. What are the most pervasive myths about Israel?
Colonizer, apartheid, genocide, three big claims, three big lies. There's a sophisticated version of the apartheid lie, and there's the less sophisticated version of the apartheid lie. Let's start with the less sophisticated version.
You have Israeli settlements in Judea and Samaria or in the West Bank.
Why can't Jews live in the Palestinian state the way Arabs live in the Jewish state, 20% of the population? Well, it's allowed in Israel. It's a fact in Israel. And yet Mahmoud Abbas and other Palestinian leaders have been very clear that they want not one Jew in a future Palestinian state. That's an obstacle to peace. Genocide is making efforts with the intention of wiping out a people. If Israel wanted to commit a genocide against Palestinians, they could have done so any day of this war and before this war. Instead, Israel went in with precision, with warnings, and ended up achieving is the best combat to civilian casualty ratio that's been achieved in urban warfare in modern times. Hamas commanders aren't stupid. They didn't think they could defeat the Israeli army. What was Israel supposed to do? Just say, hey, you massacred us, but we know if we go in to fight you back, because of the way you fight, there might be civilian casualties, so we're not going to do anything but sit here and pray you don't murder us again?
There have obviously been very shocking images coming in.
Yes.
These images have been everywhere.
Yes.
The entire world has seen them.
And Israeli soldiers that crossed lines in past wars and past conflicts with Gaza, and it was shown to have been the case, were punished for it. And there's a long record of this.
My name is Stefan Thompson, and I'm the founder of EasyGrad24, and today I'm in Las Vegas with the executive director of Maccabi Task Force, an NGO that deals with anti-Semitism on US campuses, and more importantly, perhaps, the author of Reclaiming Israel's History, Roots, Rights, and the Struggle for Peace, David Brog.
Stefan.
Good to have you, David.
Great to be with you, my friend.
The first question I have is, what are the most pervasive myths about Israel?
I think right now there are three buzzwords that dominate the anti-Israel narrative. It's colonizers. They call the Israelis, the Jews in Israel, colonizers. It's apartheid. They claim that Israel is a society with an apartheid between Jews and Arabs. And genocide. They're claiming that Israel's self-defense in Gaza is genocide. So colonizer, apartheid, genocide, three big claims, three big lies.
So the first one obviously is linked to the idea that Israel has been settled by Ashkenazi Jews specifically, right?
Yes. There is this assumption that Israel has been settled by Ashkenazi Jews, and Ashkenazi Jews are Europeans. So what we see now is a European settler colonialism, people from Europe with no connection to a land going and taking that land. And it's wrong on so many points. First of all, Ashkenazi Jews are Jews. Jews trace their roots back to the land of Israel. And DNA tests confirm it. You know, you look at Ashkenazi DNA, it's most similar to the DNA of Sephardic Jews, Jews from North Africa, and both DNA are similar to Semitic DNA. What's ironic about this whole conflict is actually, if you look at the DNA level, first of all, we're all the same. But the closest people you find are Israelis and Palestinians and Druze, the people who are living together in that region and claim that as their indigenous homeland. So Ashkenazi Jews are Jews who trace their roots back. They are indigenous to this land. And by the way, this idea that Jews are white Europeans, if only that would have been the view of Jews last century, when Jews were massacred in the millions for not being white and not being European. It's a little rich now to have people come and point at us and say you're white and had this white privilege, when every Jew in America has relatives slaughtered because they weren't white and weren't European. But let's get beyond that. Not only are Ashkenazi Jews Jews who are indigenous to Israel, but a majority of Israelis aren't even Ashkenazi Jews. A majority of Israelis are Jews from the Muslim Middle East, who lived in the Muslim Middle East in communities that predated the birth of Islam. These are ancient Jewish communities from Iran all the way to Morocco. And they were ethnically cleansed from the Muslim Middle East after the birth of Israel in 48, and that ethnic cleansing was completed after Israel's victory in the Six-Day War in 67. These ancient communities were uprooted. These Middle Eastern Jews were expelled, and they found their dignity, their independence, their safety in a different corner of the Middle East, a tiny corner of the Middle East, less than 1%, actually 0.1% of the entire landmass of the Muslim Middle East, the Jewish state of Israel. Most Israelis trace their roots back to these Jews from the Muslim Middle East. So when you call these victims of oppression of the Middle East, victims of oppression from the Muslim world and the Arab world, who found freedom and survival and safety in this corner of the Middle East that is Israel, you call them European colonizers, all you're displaying is your vast ignorance of everything having to do with Israel and the Jewish state.
So the second myth you talk about is this idea of Israel being an apartheid state.
Yeah.
The pervasive myth is that there is a separation of Israeli citizens being sort of Israeli Jews being first-class citizens, and then Israeli Arabs being second-class citizens.
Right.
But I actually think that they point their fingers and say, oh, the Arabs, the Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza are treated like second-class citizens, but they're not actually citizens of that state, right? Is there some truth to that?
Yeah.
That it's a misunderstanding of what the country even is?
There's a sophisticated version of the apartheid lie, and there's the less sophisticated version of the apartheid lie. Let's start with the less sophisticated version, which happens to be the most widespread version. And that version is that Israel is an apartheid state, much like South Africa was, where certain areas are for Jews only, and certain areas are permitted to the Arabs. The Arabs are barred from government. They're barred from civil society. They're barred from voting. They're barred from full participation as citizens of a democracy. And of course, as you know, that's lie, 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 and lie. The Arab citizens of the state of Israel, 20% of the state of Israel, are full citizens in every sense of the term. They can live wherever they want. They can vote. They are elected to government. They serve in government at the highest levels. They serve as diplomats at the highest levels. They serve as judges at the highest levels. Those who wish to defend the state of Israel serve in the army and have very high ranks in the army. They are full participants in Israel's democracy, so much so that they were even beneficiaries of affirmative action when it came to acceptance to Israel's top universities. And so you see now in Israel's top universities that Israeli Arabs are represented beyond their numbers. They're more than 20% of the top universities. And you see certain professions now where they're represented beyond their numbers. And these professions tend to be the most important professions: pharmacy, nursing, and increasingly the medical profession, doctors. And so the minute, we take a lot of students to Israel. The minute these students land in Israel, the first thing they see that shocks them and surprises them is the multicultural, multiracial celebration that is modern Israel. And the Israeli Arabs are every bit a part of that, along with the Israeli Druze and the Sephardic Jews and the Ethiopian Jews and the Ashkenazi Jews. Then there's the more sophisticated version of the apartheid lie, which says, okay, we'll admit that Israeli Arabs are full and equal citizens with Israeli Jews. But Israelis, whether Jew or Arab, have rights that Palestinians living in the West Bank don't have. Palestinians live, which is under Israeli occupation. They have rights they don't have. So the apartheid is not between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews, but between Israeli citizens and Palestinians living in the West Bank. And the answer there is yes, as a matter of fact, there are different rights, because those Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza are autonomous. They asked for autonomy and received autonomy under the peace process, under the Oslo Accords. Giving them separate treatment was not a move they viewed as aggression. It was a move they saw as a step towards what they wanted, which was an independent state, or what they said they wanted. So they were given an autonomy. So citizens living in the West Bank vote for their prime minister of the Palestinian Authority, or would vote for prime minister if Mahmoud Abbas wasn't in the 20th year of his 4-year term. If they would allow free elections, Palestinians would vote for the prime minister of the Palestinian Authority. And if they don't get to vote for prime minister of the Palestinian Authority, it's not because of Israel, it's because of their own democracy is flawed. In Gaza, they had their own autonomy, and Hamas, until Hamas executed a coup and took over power. Now there are those who say, okay, this autonomy was good, but the goal was a Palestinian state. And so unless and until the Palestinians are given a Palestinian state, the autonomy they have in the West Bank is insufficient. My answer to that would be perhaps it is. But then why did the Palestinians turn down a state so many times, including at the end of the Oslo process in the year 2000 and once again in 2008? And if your complaint is that Palestinians have autonomy but not independence, fair complaint. Why would you blame Israel, who offered the independence, instead of the Palestinians who turned down the independence and turned down the independence because ultimately their leaders did not want a Palestinian state living in peace with Israel? They decided they preferred to destroy the Jewish state and have it all. So long as Palestinian leaders are determined to have it all, they will not have their own independence. They'll keep turning it down.
So what would you say to someone who would say there are Israeli settlements, so there are Israeli citizens living in what they usually consider, the settlers obviously consider the West Bank to be Judea and Samaria,
yes,
that is under administration of the State of Israel. Conversely, the Palestinians see that as the West Bank under Israeli occupation. So there's two lenses of looking at it. You have, this is a fact, Israeli settlements in Judea and Samaria or in the West Bank. Would it be possible for Palestinian citizens, if they got together, citizens of the Palestinian Authority, bought some land in Israel and built a little settlement within Israel? Is that within the realm of plausibility?
I don't think it is, but we have to, let's take a step back and look at the settlements. Jews lived in cities in the West Bank from time immemorial. Let's take a look at Hebron, which is a very controversial city. There's been a Jewish community in Hebron since the time of King Solomon, before, actually. It was the first capital of the Jewish people before Jerusalem. That Jewish community was always there. All right, and this is one of the myths that somehow the Romans kicked out the Jews, in the first century, and the Jews, never stepped foot in the land of Israel until the Zionist movement, in the late 1900s. Not true. Jews were always in the land of Israel, even after the Roman conquest and the Roman expulsions. Jews were a majority in the land of Israel, probably until the 10th century. The Arabs conquered the land of Israel out of Arabia in the 7th century. An Arab historian, al-Maqdisi, writing in the 10th century, saying the Jews and Christians are still the majority here, not the Muslims. So this Jewish presence persisted. So Hebron, an important Jewish city, the second holiest Jewish city after Jerusalem, always had a Jewish community until before the state of Israel was born. In 1929, the Jewish community was brutally massacred by the Arabs of Hebron. It was a brutal, gory massacre. And those who weren't murdered, and it was near 100 murdered, fled and left because they saw they were going to be murdered. So this ancient Jewish community in the second most holy city in all of Judaism was wiped out in 1929. Okay, so Israel liberates Hebron after the 1967 war. And Jews who are the descendants of the Jews forced to flee Hebron in 1929 say, hey, we'd like to go back to the second holiest city in Judaism. Why can't we live there too? And so the Israeli government made a decision, and they said, yes, you can return. Same thing happened in East Jerusalem, right? East Jerusalem is where the old city of Jerusalem is located. There's a quarter of the old city called the Jewish quarter, because that's where the Jews lived, and lived until the 1948 war, when Jordan conquered the old city and expelled the Jews. And by the way, you want to look at ethnic cleansing in this conflict? The only real ethnic cleansing we've seen is after Jordan conquered East Jerusalem in 1948 and expelled every Jew from it, and before it, when the Arabs of Hebron massacred their Jewish neighbors and expelled the Jews from Hebron. So after 67, the Jewish quarter is liberated. Jews say, we want to go back to the Jewish quarter of the old city and rebuild it. The Israeli government said, okay. And this was the beginning of the settlement program. What we have is a dispute. These are disputed territories. And what the Israeli government decided was we're going to let Jews live in their ancestral homeland, in these places where Jews always lived, but we'll try to limit it. So, the settlements take up a little under 4% of the land mass of the West Bank. That's why when Ehud Barak offered the Palestinians a state in 2000, he said, we're going to give you 95% of the West Bank. We'll keep the parts that had the Jewish settlements, the 4%, 5% to add some roads. And we'll give you land from Israel to make up for that. But in any settlement, we'll keep the part that Jews have settled. When Ehud Olmert offered Mahmoud Abbas a Palestinian state in 2008, he said, we'll give you 95%, 96%. We'll keep 4% where the settlements are, and we'll give you land from Israel to make up for what we're keeping. And in both cases, it seemed like a reasonable offer. So, those who say Jews are returning to their ancient holy places, from which they were so recently expelled, is somehow an obstacle to peace. Well, no, it doesn't have to be, and it shouldn't be. It's 4% of the land, not 40, not 50. You can keep these settlements and give the Palestinians land from elsewhere to make up for it. Why can't Jews live in the Palestinian state the way Arabs live in the Jewish state, 20% of the population? Well, it's allowed in Israel. It's a fact in Israel. And yet Mahmoud Abbas and other Palestinian leaders have been very clear that they want not one Jew in a future Palestinian state. And that's an obstacle to peace.
How do you think the Palestinians view Israeli Arabs?
It's complex. I think many Palestinians understand them. In East Jerusalem, when Israel liberated it in the Six-Day War, it offered citizenship to all of the Jordanian. This was conquered by Jordan. And so they're all, the Arabs living in East Jerusalem were all Jordanian citizens. Israel offered them citizenship, but their choice. Many, because with annexation comes citizenship. You have to offer citizenship. So Israel offered it. Many have taken it up because they realize it gives them rights and protections they wouldn't otherwise enjoy. And so I think they understand why Israeli Arabs would want to be full citizens and would be happy to be full citizens. I think it's only an extreme ideological fringe that looks at an Israeli Arab enjoying life as the freest Arabs in the Middle East, as the freest Muslims in the Middle East, in the Jewish state of Israel. And they may be jealous on the inside, but would actually criticize them publicly.
I saw an interesting tweet recently by a Palestinian girl, and I sort of loosely quote, it said something along the lines of, low-key angry at my grandparents for choosing life in a refugee camp instead of taking Israeli citizenship.
Yeah.
And I thought it was an interesting post. And I wonder how many people share that sentiment in...
I think a lot. And this is another myth, by the way. There's this myth, and the myth perpetuated on purpose by the Palestinian Authority, by Mahmoud Abbas himself, by Hamas, that the 1948 war, Israel's War of Independence, was launched by Israel. Mahmoud Abbas has written this in the pages of the New York Times. It was launched by Israel to expel the Arabs from the territory that had been given to the Jews in the partition plan. That would have been quite a surprise to those Jews who fought that War of Independence with terror that they were going to be destroyed and wiped out and chased into the sea. The fact is that when the UN voted to partition this land into two states, about 50% for the Jews for a Jewish state and about 50% for the Arabs of Palestine as another Arab state. At that time, I think it was the 14th Arab state. There are 21 now. The Jews, and the state didn't include Jerusalem and its Jewish majority. Jerusalem's had a Jewish majority since the 1840s. The state offered to the Jews did not include the biblical heartland of the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. It did not include Jerusalem and its Jewish majority. Although it was 50-50, 60% of the Jewish state was desert. All of the 50% offered to the Arabs was wonderful agricultural land. Yet despite all this, after the UN voted partition, the Jews danced in the streets for joy and said yes. They wanted it. They were happy to have this piece of it. The Arabs of Palestine, of course, said no. The Arab states said no. And the Arabs of Palestine launched a war the very next day to annihilate their Jewish neighbors and destroy the Jewish state. And people always talk about the role of the Arab states who invaded and tried to destroy Israel. But what they leave out is this was a war initiated by and maintained by the Arabs of Palestine for the first 6 months. Between the partition vote in November of 1947 and the day the British withdrew completely in May of 1948, the day the Arab states invaded, the war was initiated and maintained by the Arab communities trying to destroy and wipe out the Jewish communities. And this was a struggle that the Jews did not know they would win. About a quarter of Israel's fighters were Holocaust survivors who were fresh off boats taking them to their homeland. didn't want to fight. They got off the boat, some of them wearing those striped pajamas from the death camps still, and were given a gun and went to the front. Over 1% of Israel's Jewish population at the time was killed in this war of independence. It was a high death toll. Over 2% wounded. This was a brutal struggle for survival. Now, in this war that the Arabs of Palestine started and initiated, many of them ultimately got frightened by war, as many people do, and ended up fleeing. The overwhelming majority of the Palestinian refugees fled the war their own leaders started. But in some cases, Israel did face difficult strategic decisions. They found that when they took a strategic village that had been used to shell all of the cars on the roads beneath and to stop Israel from defending itself, they took a village. If they didn't hold the village, it would be taken over again the next day. So rather than taking and retaking strategic villages, Israel did take strategic villages and expelled the residents if they were hostile. But they said, anyone who does not lift up arms against us, we will not harm. And they kept their vow. And so you ended up with an Israel born with a significant Arab population that has thrived and has grown. There are more Arabs living in Israel today than there were before the war of 1948. But you have others who made a different choice, to be hostile, to take up arms against Israel. And they're the ones maybe in those camps wishing their ancestors had made a different decision.
Do you think that had the majority of the Arabs, or Palestinian Arabs, or however we want to call them, had chosen to stay in 48 and not be hostile, and you had a drastically different demographic makeup of Israel, do you think that could have worked as a state?
It's hard to
I
say.
know it's a hypothetical, right? Everything in the realm of it's sort of this weird realm of para-history.
This is where I find the lies about Israel so far from reality. Because people like to make up this idea that the Zionists had a plan to expel the Arabs, and there was the plan going in. When you do this research, the record is very clear that in the beginning of the war, the officers of the Israeli army had no rights to expel Arabs. They were not given that opportunity. It was not open to them. It was only later in the war, when the Arab invasion was looming, when the enemy was about to grow from the Palestinian Arabs to these Arab states, and they needed to take and hold strategic areas, that Ben-Gurion gave his commanders the option of holding these strategic villages only if they had taken up arms and become hostile to Israel. And there were those in Ben-Gurion's orbit who said, no, we should go beyond that. We should use this opportunity to create a more Jewish, a more pure Jewish state. That argument was made, that argument was rejected. From day one, the Zionist leaders determined that they would not engage in acts they viewed as unjust, and among the acts they viewed as unjust would be expelling any Arab village that had not taken up arms to destroy their Jewish neighbors. They decided morality was more important than these later ideas of ethnic purity. It was just never a goal and never on the agenda of Israel's leaders. They knew that there might be challenges. They knew that the multicultural, multiracial state that they were founding might contain many citizens who were not happy or excited about the idea of a Jewish state. But they figured that's a challenge we can deal with, but we have to put justice above all. We have to put our morality above all. And I know, you're going to have Israel haters scoffing at this. I'd be very happy to go document for document, fact by fact, with any Israel hater who is scoffing at this, because these were the hard decisions that were actually made. And no greater proof that these were the actual decisions than the fact that Israel left in place so many Arab communities that have flourished under Israel, to the point, like I said earlier, the Arab population of Israel today is far larger than the Arab population of the same land before the birth of the state of Israel.
Circling back to the third myth.
Genocide.
There have obviously been very shocking images coming out.
Yes.
And they are shocking. I mean, on one hand, the widespread destruction of infrastructure, civilian infrastructure in Gaza. There have been some very unfortunate videos of Israeli soldiers in mosques, which I've seen, in Palestinian civilians' homes, and rummaging through women's clothing, and also just outright, just fairly offensive videos of soldiers firing and laughing as they do, and that is shocking. Israel, you've made the cases, is the most moral army in the world. How do you reconcile that with these images have been everywhere?
Yes.
The entire world has seen them.
So let's be careful with our claims. Have war crimes been committed? Perhaps. You know who's going to take the lead in investigating those? Israel. And Israeli soldiers that crossed lines in past wars and past conflicts with Gaza, and it was shown to have been the case, were punished for it. And there's a long record of this. But if war crimes were committed here and there, if someone was disrespectful in the way they fired their gun, you know, laughing at something so tragic as having to fire your gun, if someone was disrespectful in the mosque, let's call it what it is. That's disrespect. You know, perhaps there have been some isolated war crimes, and no army is perfect.
Of course.
No army operates with soldiers who don't make mistakes and don't commit crimes. But to leap from that very precise allegation to the allegation of genocide, right, which is sensitive with a people who suffered one of the greatest, if not the greatest genocide in the history of humanity, the Jewish people. Making that leap is what persuades so many of us that you're not serious, that you're not really interested in protecting Palestinian lives, that you're not really interested in giving Israeli soldiers a fair day of judgment, because this allegation is so much at odds with their reality. Let's keep in mind what genocide is. Genocide is in intentionally murdering a people, making efforts with the intention of wiping out a people, not only combatants, but civilians. So when you herd families into gas chambers, you're committing a genocide. You're trying to wipe out a people. If Israel wanted to commit a genocide against Palestinians, they could have done so any day of this war and before this war. Instead, what did they do? Instead, Israel went in with precision, with warnings that gave up the element of surprise constantly, and ended up achieving what, according to every military expert I've seen, says is the best combat to civilian casualty ratio that's been achieved in urban warfare in modern times. You look at the Hamas numbers, which I think are inflated. Hamas numbers always inflate and include among the dead people we find out were killed not by Israel, but by Palestinian missiles aimed at Israeli civilians that fell short. But let's take the Palestinian number, 40,000 casualties, approximately. Let's take the Israeli numbers, which tend to be more accurate. 20,000 of them were combatants. It's a combatant to civilian casualty ratio of 1-to-1. Ask any expert to achieve that in modern warfare, modern urban warfare, especially against an enemy that is so aggressive in its use of human shields as Hamas is nothing short of miraculous, nothing short of a supremely successful effort to separate innocents from combatants and go after only the combatants. This didn't just happen easily. Israel had to make decisions that cost Israeli lives to achieve this ratio. Israel could have easily bombed sites from the skies if they didn't care so much about Palestinian casualties and kept their soldiers safer. Instead, they sent their soldiers to go door by booby-trapped door to hunt down Hamas and expose themselves to risk to minimize civilian casualties. There are Israeli boys that have come home in body bags and Israeli parents who have gotten that horrific knock at the door or phone call telling them their child has fallen, only because Israel decided to risk the lives of their soldiers to spare the lives of innocent Palestinian civilians. So it's very rich for me to see Israel's critics sit on the sidelines and use that word genocide and ignore the sacrifice and the effort made to achieve what is the opposite of genocide, one of the best records, the best record in urban combat in recent history. Now, that doesn't mean that civilians haven't died. They have. If you're a human being, you cannot view these civilian deaths as anything but a tragedy. And I know most Israelis do. Most people do. Most people should. The question is, who do you blame for that tragedy? Do you blame Israel for defending itself? Or do you blame Hamas for executing a strategy that was intended to draw Israel's army in and then force Israel to fight them in civilian areas? And if you doubt that this is Hamas's strategy, then you're denying Hamas's intelligence. Hamas commanders aren't stupid. They didn't think they could defeat the Israeli army. They wanted a provocation serious enough that it would draw the Israeli army in. They tried it with missiles, firing missiles at Israeli cities by the thousands. But Israel developed Iron Dome. They were able to stop these missiles from causing human tragedy. They didn't have to go into Gaza. They could spare the civilian lives. So Hamas said, okay, we need to do something else, something more horrific to draw them in. October 7th. And when Israel's drawn in, where was Hamas? Out in those empty areas to which Israel's moved all the civilians to spare their lives? No, Hamas was under the civilian areas, in bunkers they built not to protect the civilians, but to protect themselves. And it left Israel with no choice. Either Israel went in and tried its best to separate the wicked from the innocent and take out the wicked, or what? What was Israel supposed to do? To say, hey, you massacred us, but we know if we go in to fight you back, because of the way you fight, there might be civilian casualties, so we're not going to do anything but sit here and pray you don't murder us again? What responsible government on God's green earth would respond to an attack like that, an enemy like that has promised more October 7th if they have the chance, and say, we're not going to do anything, just please stop massacring us? It's not realistic to ask Israel to do that, and no one would ask any government but Israel to do that. So, tragedy, yeah. Who do I blame? I blame the people who engineered this tragedy and did everything in their capability to make this tragedy a reality. And I will blame any Israeli soldier that we find went beyond their orders, went beyond their commands, and took measures that subjected Palestinian civilians to unnecessary risk, because that is a war crime, and that should be punished.
Hamas's greatest victory is in the realm of PR. And if you look at the demographic breakdown of broad support for Israel in the United States of America, you find that boomers are roughly 2/3 pro-Israeli, and Generation Z, Zoomers, are 2/3 pro-Palestinian. How do you think this massive shift, I mean, and it is, those numbers show a complete reversal, right, a 180 reversal of support for Israel. Why do you think that's happened?
My best guess is that the Palestinian claims, the reality, the claims, plug in perfectly into a woke mindset. We have a phenomenon here in the United States where we're told that race is everything. And that, to oversimplify, although frankly the woke mindset is this simple, white people are guilty and are oppressors and usurpers, and people of color are the indigenous, the oppressed. And this very poor way of separating innocent...
A very racist way, actually.
It is a very racist view. I'm an old-fashioned Martin Luther King Jr. type guy. I like to judge people by their actions, by the content of their character. This, of course, calls us to judge people by the color of their skin. But this is a dominant mindset. And so I think it's been very easy for Israel's haters to plug themselves into this and say, when it comes to the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians are people of color. The Israelis are white. The Palestinians are indigenous. The Israelis are colonizers. The Palestinians are oppressed. Israelis are the oppressors. False, false, and false. But to know that these three claims are false, you've got to know a little something about this conflict beyond what you might get from TikTok. And unfortunately, Israel and its supporters are outnumbered. Look, there are 21 Arab countries in the world. There are how many Muslim countries
56.
in the world? 56 Muslim countries in the world. There's one little Jewish state. There's one tiny Jewish population. And not all Jews support Israel. There are many Jews, who really are more progressive in their worldview, more woke in their worldview than they are Jewish in their worldview, and actually join the chorus of criticism. And so, in order for someone to understand just how ridiculous the lies about Israel are, they have to know a little something, and they're not getting these basic facts. So they're not learning from TikTok that most Israelis are actually people of color. Most Israelis trace their roots not back to Europe, but to the Muslim Middle East from which they were expelled and ethnically cleansed. Most people don't understand from TikTok that the Jews are indigenous to Judea, that the Arabs are indigenous to Arabia and actually conquered Judea and all of North Africa and the Fertile Crescent from the Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians who were indigenous to these places. They're the imperialists. And of course, most people don't learn from TikTok that Israel is in fact the place where the Arabs of the Middle East find the most freedom, the most security, the most ability to express themselves politically, the most opportunity to criticize or participate in their government. So these are things they have to learn. One of the things we do in the Maccabee Task Force is we take students to Israel. Not cheap. But what we found is amazing. We take students who are progressive, who are woke, who are anti-Israel, critical of Israel. And we invest in taking them to Israel and the Palestinian Authority. Why? Because it's one of the only ways we have of penetrating this silo of anti-Israel rhetoric on TikTok and X and on campus, and getting people to actually see the reality for themselves. When they do, they are almost always changed, and dramatically so. Because the reality on the ground in Israel is so diametrically opposed to the anti-Israel narrative that has dominated their information silo, and that they've never had an opportunity to peer beyond.
I've been to Israel many times. I can confirm much of what David Brog says. David, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. That was very illuminating.
It's a pleasure, Stefan. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.